Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a gorgeous day. We are having one gorgeous day, and then we're looking at a return to winter here in our area. I hope that you are enjoying the kind of day that we are. It is absolutely a beautiful day here in the mountains of Appalachia, and I hope that you are having as wonderful a day as we are here. The temperatures are even bearable. We're up near 40 degrees, I believe. So, but it's not going to last as one would not expect it to last on the 4th of February, which is today's date. But be that as it may, welcome to the Virtual Center, to our program today. This is our third program this week, and you know, we will obviously not be broadcasting again until the first of next week. And I've kind of made actually I didn't make a change. I just made a decision this morning to revisit something that it's been a while since we addressed, but I wanted to do it in light of where we were yesterday and what I think we might have accomplished yesterday. That's going to be the basis of the bulk of our program today, at least I hope so. I invite you to participate in our program and give others, as well as me, an opportunity to hear your ideas and your suggestions, your concerns about the issues being discussed here at the Virtual Center. We have a phone number that has been reserved expressly for this purpose. It is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And, of course, as we know, 4676 translates into Horn, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would appreciate hearing from you as well, and I will do the best I can to honor your email with an appropriate response. I'll do the best I can is what I will say. And so far, I've been able to do that. And so I do invite you to, if you are uncomfortable about calling in and going on the air, but you feel like you have something to say, then by all means share it with me in an email, and I'll kind of make the determination. If it seems something that other people ought to hear, then I'll just bring it on to a future program and share your thoughts and ideas. And I won't obviously identify you. So consequently, if you're more comfortable doing it that way, then by all means feel free to send me an email. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N 906, all one word, at gmail.com. Yesterday, we spent the better part of our day, abbreviated though it was. We were 1/2 hour shorter than we will be today, and than we were on Monday. But we spent the day looking at the official report of the Annapolis Convention, written by Alexander Hamilton, dated obviously the 14th of September, 1786, which was the last day of the Annapolis Convention's sessions. The sessions ran from September 11th through the 14th. And the official report, for obvious reasons, was dated September 14th. And it was sent to the states as well as to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. And as we know, and as our textbooks have been telling us for forever, it seems, the basic thrust of the report was to call for what becomes the Constitutional Convention of the United States. A second convention, another convention, to meet in Philadelphia in May of next year, May of 1787, for the express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation in order that the Constitution will be appropriate for meeting the exigencies of the Union. That's really what most people focus on with the Annapolis Convention. Only 5 states showed up. It looked like a total failure, but Alexander Hamilton was able to wrest victory from defeat, as it were, by writing a report and sending it to Congress, which encouraged Congress to request that the states appoint delegates to a convention in Philadelphia in May of 1787. This time, the charge of the delegates, the objective, if you will, of the session will not be restricted to commerce and trade interaction, as was the Annapolis Convention, but instead the purposes of this one will be broader, namely to address the exigencies of the Union and make appropriate changes in the Constitution, i.e. the Articles of Confederation, in order to make sure that government is adequately addressing the needs of the Union. We looked at this yesterday, and we looked at Hamilton's language, and we kind of, it seems to me, went through and looked at the strategy, the way that Hamilton handled the situation. There's absolutely no question, and much of this is review, I know. There's absolutely no question that many people would feel that the ministers or the delegates, the representatives of the 5 states at Annapolis, overstepped their bounds by going beyond commerce itself. In other words, they exceeded the instructions that they had been given by their home states. Hamilton is very aware of that fact. And so consequently, he takes the time in the official final report of the Annapolis Convention to address that issue. And in effect, literally to almost apologize for the fact that the delegates have gone beyond what they were appointed to do. But then he points out that he hopes that those who are concerned about this will understand the problem for the assembled delegates. Namely, that once they got into a discussion about commerce within the Union, they began to realize that commerce, trade, touched so many other areas. It touched taxation. It touched the issue of revenue. It touched the issue of foreign policy. It touched the issue of defense. It touched the issue of tariffs, of taxes on trade. And consequently, what they argued, what Hamilton was saying was, in trying to pursue the instructions we were given, which was to focus on commerce only, we began to realize that commerce touches so many other bases that we began to realize that the narrowness of the instructions which limited us to commerce made it impossible for any convention to be successful. And consequently, he focuses specifically on New Jersey's instructions to its delegates, pointing out that New Jersey had the wisdom to not bind its delegates to commerce alone, but also to give them the right to go into other areas as they saw fit in order to meet the exigencies of the Union. That's the model that Hamilton lifts from the New Jersey instructions and basically puts that down as the suggested mission of the convention to meet in Philadelphia in 1787 in May, which, as we know, is going to become the Constitutional Convention. Hamilton is very shrewd. He also points out that they really couldn't proceed on their charge, which was to consider commerce, because only 5 states had showed up, had arrived. In other words, 8 states were not represented at the Annapolis Convention. 4 of them, he tells us, didn't even appoint delegates at all. 4 of them, 3 of them in New England, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, and the 4th one being North Carolina, did appoint delegates to Annapolis, but they never showed up. And so consequently, Hamilton points out that the delegates were kind of hamstrung. They were kind of stuck because they had a charge, they had a mission, and they didn't have adequate representation to carry it out. And so therefore, what the delegates did in their wisdom, Hamilton says, was basically recognize that given the implications of commerce in so many other areas, they thought it best to call for another convention of the states, which would not be limited to commercial issues alone. It's a brilliant piece of argument on Hamilton's part. It is written in official language, in bureaucratic administrative language, which seems to use a lot of the passive voice and seems to suggest that the delegates really had no choice, given the needs of the Union, but to try to find a way towards success, to achieve success from the fact that only 5 states showed up. It's a brilliant piece. And for those of you who were able to be with us yesterday, you will recall that we tried to look at this document from the perspective of analysis, critical analysis. We even looked at the Super Bowl, and an article in the New York Times which suggested that game theory, which is so important in strategic planning for companies and for nations, game theory would suggest that Pete Carroll's decision in Sunday's Super Bowl may not have been the mistake that many people are concluding it was. That in the context of game theory, Carroll might have been right. Because not only does everybody who supported Seattle in the Super Bowl believe that the last play should have been a handoff to Marshawn Lynch, Game theory points out that obviously Bill Belichick and the Patriots expected that handoff as well. And so consequently, in order to come up with something that the New England Patriots wouldn't expect, it was necessary to try to get into their heads a little bit and anticipate what they're going to anticipate and act accordingly. And that kind of strategic thinking calls for the kind of critical analysis that we're talking about. And Hamilton's document is a classic example of that. And so that was the approach that we took in yesterday's program. Not only looking at the content of Hamilton's document, but also the tone, the strategy that Hamilton employs in order to get his way. How he is able to apologize, to skirt some of the major issues, to basically argue for a point of view which really leaves the states and Congress not much option except to appreciate what the delegates, those that were there, the 12 that were there at Annapolis, were able to do under unfortunate circumstances where only 5 states sent delegates. It's a beautiful argument. Toward the end of yesterday's program, I was struck by the reality, of course, that a letter which we had looked at some time ago here at the Virtual Center, a letter by Otto, the French ambassador in New York, back to his home government in Paris, back to Vergennes, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the French king. Otto focuses this letter, which we looked at some months ago here at the Virtual Center, on this report of the Annapolis Convention. This morning, as I was preparing for today's program, I went back and reread the Otto letter. Obviously, we've covered it more than once, a couple of times, I believe, here at the Virtual Center over the last several months. But the fact of the matter is, fresh upon reading Hamilton's report yesterday, it became clear to me that there's a lot in that letter that becomes much clearer now that we've been through Hamilton's report. Since the letter is about the report, then it stands to reason that looking at the report and then looking at what Otto says about the report would naturally reveal much more substance. And I kind of made the decision this morning that the best thing we could do here today is revisit the Otto letter. Because I believe that while that letter packed a punch the first time we looked at it, now that we've looked at Hamilton's report, I think we're going to appreciate even more of what Otto is saying and implying in that particular document. I have Hamilton's report in my hand, and I have the Otto letter in my other hand. And what I really wanted to do was to point out some of the strategy that Hamilton uses. And we looked at this yesterday. So I thought that I would begin by a quick run-through of Hamilton's argument. We spent almost the entire program on it yesterday, so I don't think it's going to be necessary to take a lot of time. I don't think there's going to be additional information in the report itself. Where I think we're going to be quite surprised is how meaningful Otto's letter becomes now that we've read the document that he's writing about. Quickly, you'll recall, and this is a quick overview, that Hamilton begins by pointing out that of the 5 states that showed up at Annapolis 3 of the states, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, sent their delegates with essentially the same instructions, which were to limit their charge to considerations of commerce only. He points out that a 4th state that's represented at Annapolis, Delaware, sends its delegates with pretty much the same instructions, except that Delaware also recommends that whatever the final report is of the Annapolis Convention should go to Congress. That's an addition to what the other 3 states provide. And then finally, the 5th state, which is New Jersey, is the one that Hamilton really focuses on, because it's the one that expands the charge of delegates beyond considerations of commerce alone by saying, and this is quoted directly from the New Jersey instructions, they were to seek or to consider a uniform system in commercial regulations and other important matters that would enable the United States in Congress assembled effectually to provide for the exigencies of the Union. That's the opening. That's the opening to call the convention in Philadelphia and not limit it to considerations of trade alone. Then Hamilton goes into almost an apologetic mode, explaining that the commissioners realize that they weren't charged beyond the issue of commerce for the most part, but that they were so deeply impressed with the magnitude and importance of the object confided to them that they found it necessary that speedy measures be taken to effect a general meeting of the states. In other words, once they got together, once they put their heads together, Hamilton is saying, it became clear that we can't accept only 5 states showing up as failure and go home, because the exigencies of the Union demand more. They demand something more. So therefore, out of regard for the plight of our Union, the delegates decided that we needed to go in a different direction and call another convention, but this time make it charge it to address such purposes in public affairs that the nation's plight may require. Then he points out that it appears that we've overstepped our bounds, and I hope that you will understand why we did this. And of course, he goes back to New Jersey again for justification. Hamilton says, we're not going to go through all the issues that the nation faces. That's for the convention to do. So we decline. He says, your commissioners decline an enumeration of those national circumstances on which their opinion respecting the propriety of a future convention with more enlarged powers is founded. In other words, we're not going to go into the details now. But basically what he's saying is, please trust us that after our meeting, after our discussions, we really realized that this is important. Under this impression, Hamilton says, your commissioners, with the most respectful deference, beg leave to suggest their unanimous conviction that it may essentially tend to advance the interests of the Union if the states, by whom they have been respectively delegated, would themselves concur and use their endeavors to procure the concurrence of other states. In other words, that the 5 that did show up will use their influence to persuade the other states, And in turn, all the states will make sure or support Congress's call for such a second convention. That's the report of the Annapolis Convention. That's the official report. I think it's a brilliant job. I think, like any document, it seems to me, if one is going to be critical about it and really extract the meaning that is there, you've got to go between the lines. You've got to look not only at what the document says, but by understanding the particular context in which the document is drafted, we can understand what the document does not say. And I think that's as important. I mention that as an introduction to consideration of this letter by Louis Otto, French ambassador to New York, sent in French to his boss, the Comte de Vergennes, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the French king. The date of Otto's letter is October 10th. It is not quite a full month after Hamilton's report of September 14th. It's 24 days later. But since we have just looked at the report itself, I really believe that there's so much in Otto's letter that I missed when we went through it some months ago, because all we had was what Otto said about the report, but we didn't actually read the report. Now we have. So let's look at Otto's letter. My Lord, the commissioners named by various states to propose a general plan of commerce and to give to Congress the powers necessary to execute it were meeting in Annapolis over the last month. But only 5 states being represented, they did not think they should broach the principal question, and they limited themselves to addressing to Congress and to the various state legislatures a report that characterizes the present spirit of this country's politics. Already, Otto has suggested that there's a hidden agenda here. Basically, what Otto is telling Vergennes is that only 5 states were represented, so therefore the commissioners did not believe that they should approach the principal question. If you read Hamilton's report, the fact that only 5 states showed up is the principal question, commerce. What Otto is suggesting is that revision of the articles, a total change in the structure of government, is really the agenda here. And then Otto says the following. In translating this report, I have taken care not only to put it into French, but to render it intelligible. They endeavored to give the original an obscurity that the people will see through with difficulty, but which the powerful and enlightened citizens will not fail to turn to account. Otto is saying that Hamilton's report is written in a way where the average person would not be able to deduce the real agenda. But the powerful and enlightened citizens will be able to see that agenda just fine. they'll know what's really going on with this report, but the masses of the people will not. As we went through Hamilton's report yesterday and the brief summary that we just completed moments ago, I hope, that we were able to recognize, again, what Hamilton was saying, but also what he was not saying. It's very obvious that what's in the New Jersey instructions to its commissioners, namely not limiting their charge to just commerce, but allowing them to get into whatever they need to get into in order that Congress can meet the exigencies of the Union, it's clear by the way that Hamilton jumps on that and uses it that that's really the agenda here. The agenda here is to revise the whole structure of government on the national level. The agenda is not commerce, even though the report says it is, and even though most states sent delegates to deal strictly with commerce alone. Hamilton recognizes that the real agenda is bigger. Now let's consider Madison. Because Madison is really not too comfortable with the Annapolis Convention because he's afraid that it'll be successful. Madison is afraid that if the convention that meets at Annapolis is successful in its efforts to come up with a compromise plan to manage trade between the states, that will take the pressure off the other areas of the Constitution of the Articles of Confederation that need changing as well. In other words, Madison's goal is total revision of the Articles of Confederation. They use commerce to get delegates to come to Annapolis. But the real agenda goes way beyond the issue of commerce. What bothers Madison is, what if the convention does reach some sort of a plan or agreement on commerce? Then how are we going to get them to consider the other issues that need to be addressed? How are we going to get them to come to another convention to deal with many of the other areas where the Articles of Confederation is so weak? And remember, Madison was the architect, the author of the vices of the political system of the political system of the United States, which listed a whole litany of weaknesses and problems that the nation faced as a result of the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation. So Madison has told us in that report, which comes out just between the Annapolis Convention and the convening of the Philadelphia Convention, that's Madison's agenda. Madison is uncomfortable with Annapolis for fear that it will be successful in the area of commerce. Because if it is, then they're not going to have the kind of impetus they need to get states to send delegates to another convention. I'm going to say something here. Given that reality, given the fear that a successful Annapolis Convention will sabotage the possibility of the Philadelphia Convention, then aren't we left to conclude that the fact that 8 states didn't show up at Annapolis and only 5 states did turns out to be a positive for Madison and Hamilton? In other words, it's very fortuitous that 8 states are not there, because then it becomes possible to say, with such a small turnout, we couldn't do what we were sent here for. But on the other hand, we are so worried about the Union that we urge you to consider another convention, da-da-da-da-da-da. That raises yet another question. Hamilton's report says that 4 states didn't appoint delegates at all. But 4 states did. 3 of them in New England: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. And the 4th one is North Carolina. They appointed delegates, but those delegates never showed up. I wonder why. Because given the real agenda of the Annapolis Convention, it's very fortunate for Madison and Hamilton that they didn't show up. Because if they showed up, you would have the 5 that were there plus these 4. You would have 9 of the 13 states, which ironically is the number of states that the Constitution is going to require in order to ratify. 9 of the 13. If 9 states had showed up at Annapolis, then Hamilton's argument that the small turnout made it impossible for us to follow through on our mission, that argument would fall through. It would not be credible. So consequently, it turns out to be a plus for Hamilton that the 4 states which appointed delegates never showed up at Annapolis. Back to the Otto letter. So already Otto has said that 5 states only showed up. So consequently, they really couldn't get into the real agenda. And they couldn't really address ostensibly the reason that they were appointed, which is to do something about commerce. Otto goes on. For a very long time, my lord, they have felt the necessity of giving the federal government more energy and vigor. But they have also felt that the excessive independence accorded to the citizens with regard to the states and to the states with regard to Congress is too dear to individuals for them to be divested of it without great precautions. Let's look at that sentence again. For a very long time, my lord, they, meaning the powerful and enlightened citizens, which he made reference to earlier as the ones that would really understand what the Annapolis Convention was about. For a long time, my lord, they have felt it necessary of giving the federal government more energy and vigor. But they have also felt that the excessive independence accorded to the citizens with regard to the states and to the states with regard to Congress is too dear to individuals for them to be divested of it without great precautions. The powerful and enlightened citizens for a long time have wanted to create more vigor, more energy in the government, i.e., more power to act. But they also realize that the independence, the freedom that people have been given under the Republican governments of the states, and the independence that the states have in relationship to Congress because they are sovereign under the Articles of Confederation, means that the objectives of these powerful enlightened citizens, namely to give more power to the central government, can't be taken away from them without great precautions. If we try to move on what we really want, we're going to run into opposition. So we got to be shrewd. We got to be careful. Otto continues. The people are not unaware that the natural consequences of a greater power accorded to the government will be a regular collecting of taxes, a strict administration of justice, extraordinary duties on imports, strict actions against debtors, and lastly, a marked preponderance of the rich men and the great proprietors. The people know that along with strengthening the power of the central government, they're going to face consequences. Namely, they're going to be faced with a government that can much more effectively collect taxes. A government that will be much better able to administer justice. A government that is going to be able to collect duties on trade, on imports. A government that would be willing and able to take strict actions against debtors, which most of the people are debtors, not creditors, debtors. And lastly, they are going to be confronted with an increase in power of the wealthy and the great proprietors. Much more influence and power of the rich and the well-born. The people know that. And the powerful and enlightened citizens, Otto was saying, know that the people know that. So therefore, they have got to be duplicitous. They have got to be careful. Not to blow their cover. Not to let the people know what the real agenda is all about. It is therefore, Otto says, in the interest of the people to preserve as much as possible the absolute liberty that was accorded to them at a time when they knew no other law than necessity, and when an English army laid, so to speak, the foundations of the political constitution. What Otto is saying is the people understand that the only reason they got what they have is because the pressure of the pressures created by the war. But Otto was saying the powerful and enlightened citizens know that the people know that. We are talking game theory here. We're talking manipulation. We're talking evasion. We're talking obfuscation. it seems to me we're talking about some very interesting stuff, given the fact that these are the people responsible for framing the Constitution of the United States. Otto closes this particular paragraph with the following sentence. It is in these tempestuous times that it was necessary to agree that all power should emanate only from the people, that everything be submitted to its supreme will, and that the magistrates be only its servants. Wow. Wow. What Otto is saying is, because the powerful and enlightened citizens know that the people know that the freedom they got is only because of the pressures created by the War for Independence, the powerful and enlightened citizens decide that whatever we do, we are going to have to defer, at least ostensibly defer, to the sovereignty and the freedom and the power of the people. Therefore, that's when it became necessary for the powerful and enlightened to agree that all power should emanate only from the people, the consent of the governed, that everything be submitted to its supreme will, to the will of the people, and that magistrates be seen as servants of the people, not masters of the people. In other words, because of what the people expect, we've got no choice but to seemingly give them what they want. That all power comes from the people are all powerful, government representatives are the servants of the people, etc. That's what they believe, and we have no option at this point except to give them that. What we're seeing here is an example of duplicity of the highest order by the enlightened and the powerful in the way they deal with the citizenry in this republic. Now you're probably saying, who's Otto? How does he know this stuff? He is the official representative of the French king in America. And he is reporting back to Vergennes, his supervisor, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He is based in New York. He's at the center of government. He's in touch with all of these powerful and enlightened citizens. He knows what they're thinking. He knows what they're doing. He knows what they want. And he knows that they've got to be very, very careful how they go about getting it. And he's reporting that back to Paris. Even if he's wrong, Vergennes has no option except to believe it. This is the official report coming from his representative in New York. So as far as France is concerned, this is what's really going on in American politics. This is the context for the creation of the Constitution of the United States. This is what it's all about. This is what we have to find a way to present to our young. Because once they get this, and once they understand it, they will appreciate the context. They will appreciate the charge. They will appreciate Hamilton's dilemma, if you will, at Annapolis. We've got to find a way that this conference, this convention at Annapolis, called to find some way toward commercial reform, is not successful. Because if it is successful, we're going to lose the war while we win this one battle. And we can't afford to do that. Otto goes on, and I had marked this particular paragraph from before as being very important. Although, and this is Otto's commentary on the structure, the social structure in America, in the former British colonies. Although there were no patricians in America, no upper class, so to speak, no House of Lords, although there were no patricians in America, there is a class of men known under the denomination of gentlemen, who by their wealth, by their talents, by their education, by their families, or by the positions that they fill, aspire to a preeminence that the people refuse to accord them. And although several of these men have betrayed the interests of their class in order to acquire popularity, there reigns among them a liaison, all the more intimate, since they fear almost all the efforts of the people to despoil them of their possessions, and since they are in addition creditors, and consequently interested in strengthening the government and attending to the execution of the laws. Otto is reporting there's no upper class, so to speak, in America. They go to great lengths to make that point, that they are a republic. There's no elite. There's no upper class. There's no rich and well-born, at least publicly. But Otto says there is this group that call themselves gentlemen, and they believe that their wealth, their talent, their education, their heritage, their families, and the positions that they hold give them the right to be like an upper class, to be elite. But in the republic, the people won't give them that. Some of these gentlemen seemingly have sold out their class, because in order to become popular with the people, they seem to have turned against their own kind, against other gentlemen. But the fact is, there is a class-based liaison. There is a communication among gentlemen which is more intimate, more important, because since they fear the efforts of the people to deny them, to take away what they have, and to deny them the prestige that they feel they should get. And besides that, since they are creditors and they're owed money, they want the kind of government reform. They want a government that'll give them what they have coming to them, which is the money that's owed them, but also the prestige that they feel they have a right to, but under the Confederation with power in the states, they were never able to fully receive. That, to Otto, is the social reality of American society. The people captivated, carried away, drunk, if you will, with the liberty and the freedom and the opportunities that they believe that independence is going to give them. It's not just figment of their imagination. That's what Jefferson said in the Declaration, that all men are created equal. They have certain natural rights. Governments are created deriving their power from the consent of the governed. Hell, this isn't a figment of their imagination. This is what the Declaration of Independence says. This is what the war was about. But now Otto is saying there's this upper class group that has become more intimate than ever because they're walking on eggshells. They got to be careful what they say and how they say it, and what they do and how they do it, in order to be able to get what they believe they have coming to them. The only way to do it is to be evasive, not to be upfront. What I'm suggesting is Otto is saying to Vergennes that the few are really engaged in an extremely important, duplicitous effort to convince the people that the changes in government that they want are really going to be to the people's best interests, when in fact they know that it's principally going to be to their interests. I would suggest to you that right here in this concept is the background for the Federalist Papers. Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, to a minor degree, set out to publish 85 papers as part of their effort to convince the people that the things you fear about the changes in government that the Constitution reflects are not really things you need to worry about. What Hamilton is saying is that there are these people out there that are trying to manipulate the people by telling them that all these horrible things are going to happen. And the Federalist Papers are designed issue by issue, item by item, paper by paper, to deny the realities and the substance of people's fear of government. Yet Otto is saying that that fear is well placed, because this is exactly what these people, these so-called powerful and enlightened citizens, are all about. We have another, I was going to get into the next paragraph, but we're at 59 minutes after the hour. We're right at the top of our first hour. I don't know about you, but as I read Otto's letter this time, I'm finding much more substance in it, much more meaning to it, than when we looked at Otto's letter in the abstract, in isolation. Once you look at the letter in the context of Hamilton's report from the Annapolis Convention, you begin to see what Otto was talking about. Because Hamill's report validates exactly what Otto is reporting to Vergennes is going on here in America in the fall of 1786. We have reached the top of the hour. It is 2 p.m. in the East on this Wednesday. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break. And then we'll be back and we'll look at the rest of Otto's letter, Otto's report to Vergennes. And we'll try to draw some conclusions. I believe that this particular issue, the Otto letter, in the context of the report by Hamilton from the Annapolis Convention, really sets the agenda, really creates the background for the Constitutional Convention. And then when you add to that Madison's Vices of the Political System, which he authors the next spring, April of 1787, a month before the convention is due to meet, then you begin to get from Madison an itemized list of the issues he believes the convention must address in order to really meet the exigencies of the Union. I believe that this is so important and so informative. I believe it tells us so much we need to know about our founders, about the challenges they faced, and the lengths to which they believe they had to go in order to give us the Constitution of the United States. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Obviously, I believe that civic responsibility, in part, is to know these things. That's kind of what we're about. I invite you to stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break, and we'll complete the second hour of the Virtual Center on this Wednesday, the 4th of February, 2015. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
A little something funky for an early February afternoon. I'm glad you liked it, Dr. Bill.
I do. Thank you. That was great. And I'm really loving this Otto letter. I really am.
Oh,
I'm hoping the folks are getting as much out of it as I am.
Oh, I have a sneaking suspicion they are.
I hope so. Thank you, Bob. Welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is just beyond the top of the hour. We're at 7 minutes after the hour of 2 in the East. We are in the midst of the Otto letter to Vergennes, which is Otto's report to France on the recently concluded Annapolis Convention and the report written for that convention by Alexander Hamilton. We will continue that in this our second hour. But I do solicit your input, your reactions. I'm obviously a little bit carried away with this stuff. And again, it's kind of like there aren't that many movies that I can say I watch again and again and again and still get to enjoy and still get to learn. But there are some. Those are the classics. And these documents do the same thing for me as the best of movies. Because I find that in going through them and looking at them and appreciating the context which gives them meaning, they continue to teach more and more and more of our nation's history, and I absolutely love it. I find it infectious. I hope, I pray, that I am able to convey a little bit of that enthusiasm to you folks listening. If you do have a reaction, you'd like to comment, by all means feel free to do that. We have a phone number, area code 304-663-4676. 304-663, HORN, HORN. If you would like to email me directly, on these issues, I would love to hear from you. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. In dealing with the Otto letter in the context of the Hamilton report on the Annapolis Convention, we had ended our first hour at a very appropriate place. Specifically, we had ended our first hour with Otto's report or analysis for Vergennes about the duplicitous nature, if you will. He doesn't use the word duplicitous, that's my word, of what he calls gentlemen, those people in America who are creditors and who therefore want a government with more vigor and more energy in order to make government much more efficient and much more effective, principally in the context of these gentlemen being, for the most part, creditors. In other words, government reformed or revised would become the agent of creditors in their efforts to require debtors to pay up. But also, these gentlemen, Otto says, also believe that their family backgrounds, their education, their wealth, their influence, the caliber of the positions they hold, all of these things give them the right to a position of influence and respect that they feel they are not being accorded, especially after the revolution, especially as a result of the philosophies which rationalized and explained and justified independence from Great Britain. In other words, the people have become so caught up in the idea of equality, in the idea of consent of the governed, in the idea that their elected representatives are really their servants. Government is the servant of the people. That this is costing gentlemen the respect that they feel they are owed. So they have these reasons as well as financial reasons for wanting to strengthen the central government and to revise it and make it much more effective. And they've got to do it in ways which seemingly cater to the prejudices and the priorities of the people. We've got to get what we want, but in order to get it, we're going to have to do it in a way that the people don't suspect. Otto goes on. They have tried in vain, my lord, by pamphlets and by other publications to propagate notions of justice and of integrity, and to divest the people of a liberty of which they make such bad use. What Otto is referring to here are the efforts through the Confederation period to put articles in the paper and pamphlets and handbills and all the rest of it, calling for justice and the rights of the minority party, and we got to do what's fair and just and honest and all the rest of it. People need to meet their obligations, their responsibilities, and all the rest of it. They've done that over and over again. They've tried in vain to get the people to surrender the liberty which they are abusing. The implication is that the optimism which was so prevalent as a result of independence, their optimism about government and the wisdom of the people and all the rest of it, Otto is suggesting to Vergennes that these gentlemen believe that they expected too much from the people. And now we've got to find a way to rein them in, because they've got more liberty than they can handle. Consequently, Otto is suggesting they are abusing it. In proposing a new organization of the federal government, they would have caused all minds to rebel. If these gentlemen had openly been upfront about it, and gone to the people with a request to reorganize the federal government, they would have gotten nowhere. They represented I skipped a line here. In proposing a new organization of the federal government, they would have caused all minds to rebel. Ruinous circumstances for the commerce of America have happily chanced to furnish the reformers a pretext to introduce some innovations. Otto is saying that the call for commercial reform, which produced the Annapolis Convention, was a pretext. It just so happened that the commercial problems which were real in America happened at just the right time for them, because it could be used as a justification for going after something bigger. They represented to the people that the name American had become a disgrace among all the nations of Europe. In other words, this is the strategy that the gentlemen, so-called, the powerful and enlightened citizens, this is the strategy that they adopt. The first thing they do is they make it clear to the people that in Europe everybody's laughing at them. Everybody is making fun of us, and we can't do anything about it. They represented to the people that the name American had become a disgrace among all the nations of Europe, that the flag of the United States was everywhere exposed to insults and vexations, that the farmer, no longer being able to freely export his produce, would soon be reduced to the last misery, that it was time to employ reprisals and to prove to foreign nations that the United States would not suffer this violation. Excuse me. That the United States would not suffer this violation of the freedom of commerce with impunity, but that vigorous measures could only be taken by unanimous consent of the 13 states, and that, Congress not having the necessary powers, it was essential to form a General Assembly charged to present it with the plan that it should adopt, and to indicate to it the means to execute it. In other words, by making the people believe and appreciate that the United States has become the laughingstock of Europe, what we need to do is get our commercial house in order, get our commercial act together, so that we have the power to retaliate against those who would make fun of us. In other words, they are playing to the vanity and the patriotism of the people in order to get the people on board in support of the kind of reforms in government that they believe are necessary for a whole different set of reasons. Congress, they say, Otto says, Congress doesn't have the power to do it. So therefore, it's essential to form a General Assembly and present it with a plan that would make recommendations as to what we could do to execute the kind of reprisals that we want. The people, generally discontented with the difficulties of commerce, and little suspecting the secret motives of their antagonists, embraced this measure with ardor and named commissioners who were supposed to meet in Annapolis at the commencement of September. In other words, this is the background, this is the story that the gentleman gave to the people in order to build support for the appointment of delegates to go to Annapolis. We're going to strengthen the commercial capabilities of this nation so that no longer will we have to put up with the abuse that we are getting from other nations. And by playing to the vanity and the pride and the patriotism of the American people, they are successfully able to get the people on board to support commercial reform, which means that the states follow through by appointing delegates to the Annapolis Convention. Otto goes on. The authors of this proposition, my lord, had no hope or even any desire to see this assembly of commissioners, which should only prepare a question much more important than that of commerce, succeed. That sentence says it all. The authors of this proposition, Hamilton, my lord, had no hope or even any desire to see this assembly of commissioners, which should only prepare a question much more important than that of commerce, succeed. What Otto is saying to Vergennes here is that Hamilton and Madison and the rest of them didn't want the Annapolis Convention to be successful. Because if it was, then it would circumvent, it would undercut the need for a more general convention dealing with more elaborate reforms in a variety of different areas. The measures were so well taken that at the end of September, there were no more than 5 states represented in Annapolis. And the commissioners of the northern states were held up for several days in New York in order to delay their arrival. Oh my God. Otto is saying that the 4 states whose commissioners never showed up at Annapolis were held up in New York in order to keep them from getting there. The failure of the Annapolis Convention to draw more than 5 states was intentional. It was the way that those who wanted to revise the entire structure of government were going to get what they wanted. They call a convention, they get people all worked up about commercial retaliation. They appoint delegates, but only 5 states show up, and it looks like the thing was a failure. But in fact, the reason only 5 states show up is because delegates from 4 additional states were held up in New York in order to keep them from getting there. What does that tell us? I read that sentence before. When we looked at this document some months ago, I looked at that sentence, but it didn't really ring true to me what it was saying, Because even though I knew that 5 states only showed up, I assumed they didn't show up because they didn't want to go. But now we learn from Hamilton's report that 4 states who appointed delegates never got representation at the convention. Therefore, the report that Hamilton writes is a report that not only reports failure, but in fact, it's the product of failure that is intentional. The Annapolis Convention could not succeed to achieve commercial reform because those behind it made sure that it could not work. The measures were so well taken that at the end of September there were no more than 5 states represented at Annapolis because the commissioners from the northern states were held up for several days in New York in order to delay their arrival. The assembled states, after having waited almost 3 weeks, had broken up on the pretext that they were not numerous enough to enter into the matter, and to justify this dissolution, they sent the various legislatures and Congress a report, of which I have the honor to send you the enclosed translation. In this document, the commissioners make use of an infinity of circumlocutions and ambiguous phrases to explain to their constituents the impossibility of taking into consideration a general plan of commerce and the powers relative thereto, without touching at the same time on other objects intimately connected with the prosperity and the national importance of the United States. Because they were able to keep delegates from 4 states from showing up at Annapolis, that meant that Hamilton could write a report which said that we couldn't do our business because we didn't have enough states. But on the other hand, we were so concerned and so worried about the circumstances and the challenges facing America, facing the United States, that we have taken it upon ourselves to recommend to all the states and to Congress the convening of another convention in Philadelphia next May, which will not be limited to just commerce, but will be able to take in all of the problems, all the challenges that the country faces. Without naming these objects, because remember, Hamilton said in his report, we're not going to go into details, that's for the convention to do. Without naming these objects, the commissioners elaborate on the present crisis of public affairs, on the dangers to which the Confederation is exposed, on the discredit of the United States in foreign countries, and on the necessity of reconciling under a single point of view the interests of all the states. In other words, the delegates who are there at Annapolis take the opportunity of not being able to fulfill their responsibilities in the area of commerce to move toward the real agenda. Which is to put more power, more vigor, and more energy into the hands of the central government. They conclude by proposing for the month of May next a new Assembly of Commissioners charged not only with deliberating on a general plan of commerce, but, and this is in italics, this is highlighted in Otto's letter, not only will this convention called for Philadelphia in May deal with the issue of commerce, but, quote, on other matters that might interest the harmony and the well-being of the states, and on the means of adapting the federal government to the needs of the Union, which is exactly what New Jersey's instructions to Annapolis said. What Otto is saying is that the trap has been sprung. The people got all fired up and determined to retaliate against European nations by reforming commerce in America. And the real architects of the call for Annapolis make sure that Annapolis can't succeed so that the Philadelphia Convention can happen. This is absolutely incredible, I think. My Lord, in spite of the obscurity of this document, you will perceive, my Lord, that the commissioners do not wish to take into consideration the grievances of commerce, infinitely interesting to the people, without perfecting at the same time the fundamental Constitution of Congress. What Otto is saying to Vergennes, he is pointing out that basically they didn't want commerce discussed at all. What they really wanted was a convention that would address the fundamental Constitution of Congress, the nature of state power versus the power of the federal government. That's the reform that they really wanted. But they couldn't say that until Annapolis failed. The last sentence in Otto's letter says the following: "It is hoped that the new commissioners will be named with powers sufficiently extensive to deliberate on these important subjects and to put Congress in a position not only to approve resolutions for the prosperity of the Union, but to execute them." What they believe is going to come out of Philadelphia is the kind of revisions in the structure of government which will end up giving Congress not only the power to make resolutions, to pass laws, but to enforce them, which means power over the states. State sovereignty, the essence of Republican government, which Montesquieu had said needed to be small. It needed to be Republican government, in order to work, needed to be in a small area. Thus, the states are all structured around the principle of Republican government. But the reforms that these people wanted literally would redefine the meaning of republicanism. We know from previous programs here at the Virtual Center that the Constitution of the United States, Article 4, contains a clause in which the federal government guarantees a federal form of republicanism to each state. Every state under the Constitution is guaranteed a Republican form of government. In the 1840s, in Rhode Island, the meaning of Republican government, in other words, what exactly does that mean? What does Republican government require? What powers do the people really have in republicanism? That issue ends up before the Supreme Court of the United States in 1842. And the Supreme Court defers on that issue. It refuses to define republicanism. Instead, the court kicks that question back to the states and says it's up to the states to make the determination. It's up to Congress, the legislative branch, to make the determination as to what the guarantee of a Republican form of government really means. And we know from a previous Federalist paper that Hamilton and Madison both have said that if the people can vote, if the people can elect representatives, then that means that Republican government is in effect. In other words, the change in power in the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution of the United States takes what I believe the substance, the heart, the soul of Republican government and reduces it to the right of the people to participate. If the people can participate in the election of representatives, then republicanism is alive and well in America. That's the way Madison and Hamilton redefine Republican government. Consequently, the sign or the signal that Republican government lives in America are our elections. The fact that we have regular elections, the fact that they are open, the fact that First Amendment freedoms prevail in these elections, the right to speak, the right to assemble, the right to a free press, the right to religious freedom. As long as these rights prevail and people can participate in the government over them, then Republican government is alive and well in America, say the Federalist Papers. This transition from the Articles to the Constitution involves a shift in the meaning of republicanism, which is huge, which is gargantuan, because involved in it is not only where power will be located, but more importantly, who will have it and who will not. The ability of the people to influence government when power was on the state level under the Articles of Confederation, the heart of republicanism, according to Montesquieu, is gone with the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. And in its place comes regular and frequent elections, frequent exercises of mass participation of the people. That, to the founders, seems to constitute the essence of republicanism under the Constitution of the United States. And now we find in the 21st century, late 20th and 21st, that in a series of substantive, meaningful court decisions, namely Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, and the more recent Citizens United decision in 2010, in which the Supreme Court affirms that political contributions constitute speech. We are creating a situation in America where the one last vestige of republicanism that continues to exist, which is the right of the people to participate and own the election of their representatives, is being transformed and transferred to big money, to the point that a week ago Monday, the Koch brothers announced their plans to amass $889 million in order to invest in Republican victory in the presidential and congressional elections to be held in 2016. I believe that what we've covered on this Wednesday, the 4th day of February, is gargantuan. It is 40 minutes after the hour. We still have 20 minutes left in our program today, but I don't want to allow what we have already done to pass into oblivion without an appreciation and attention, direct attention, to what I believe the significance of this is. I believe it is absolutely enormous. I believe that the auto letter to Vergennes on October 10th, 1786, is one of the most important pieces of historical information from the 18th century that exists. But I also believe that it needs to be read in conjunction with Hamilton's report on the Annapolis Convention. It is absolutely vital, it seems to me, to appreciate the fact that the apparent failure of the Annapolis Convention was not failure at all. It was success. A success achieved by the failure of delegates from all the states who appointed delegates to show up at Annapolis. Literally, the architects of political reform and revision of the Articles of Confederation played a role in making sure that the delegates appointed to Annapolis didn't all show up. Consequently, it was not possible for the Annapolis Convention to be successful. It was doomed to failure. But in reality, according to Otto, and according to what we've seen, in reality, the failure of Annapolis was in reality its success, because it made it possible to call the Philadelphia Convention, which produces the Constitution of the United States. And the reforms desired by those Otto referred to as gentlemen are enacted with the ratification of that Constitution. I really believe that what we've covered today in an hour and 40 minutes approximately, or an hour and 45 minutes, may be some of the most important information and materials related to ratification of the Constitution, to the mission of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and civic responsibility. Within the context of the story that we have shared on this Wednesday afternoon, how do we define civic responsibility? What do we mean by civic responsibility? What do we mean by the role of citizens in this republic? What is the principal obligation and responsibility of citizens? Is that fulfilled? Is their responsibility, their accountability as citizens, is it fulfilled by the act of voting? There's absolutely no question that the bigger the turnouts at our elections, the more people show up in order to go through the exercise of consenting to be governed by the result of elections, by the results of the elections, the stronger the republic is. The danger of big money, which is rapidly seeming to me to take control of our electoral process, is indeed likely to keep people from participating, to create the feeling amongst many citizens that voting for them is a waste of time, since the people who can speak the loudest by making the biggest contribution are really calling the shots. Therefore, why should I show up? Why should I go? Why should I participate? It doesn't really matter. But the fact of the matter is, the essence of Republican government as defined by the framers, by Madison and Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, the essence of republicanism requires the massive turnout of citizens in order to fulfill the definition of republic. Anything that inhibits the participation of citizens in the electoral process becomes a direct threat to republicanism. I think, and this is, I am at this point, this is all speculation on my part. I have closed the book on Otto. This is all me. It's all interpretive, and I'm basically throwing these things out with a hope that those, some of you at least who are listening, will respond and offer your thoughts, either via email or perhaps next week when we get back together again, by availing yourself of the phone number. But it seems to me that the full implications, the ramifications of Citizens United and the 5-4 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, in terms of what dangers that decision has created for the essence of Republican government in America, seems potentially to violate the Article 4 guarantee of Republican government that is contained in the Constitution. By jeopardizing the essence of republicanism as redefined by ratification of the Constitution, if the Supreme Court does something which inhibits Republican government in America, we are experiencing unconstitutional activity on the role of the Supreme Court. I'm not going to go so far as to call it high crimes and misdemeanors or any of that other stuff. But the fact of the matter is, I believe that the ramifications of Citizens United pose a direct threat to the success of this republic, because it has all the potential in the world of inhibiting the turnout at the polls. And what the founders have told us is that the strength of the republic absolutely depends on mass participation of citizens. So if government does something to jeopardize and threaten that participation, that means effectively that it is inhibiting Republican government itself. And the Constitution of the United States guarantees a Republican form of government. It doesn't define republicanism. All Article 4 refers to is a Republican form of government. And the court has deferred defining exactly what the ingredients of that form will be. But the one thing we do know is that it includes mass participation. And therefore, government needs to be doing everything that it can do to encourage, to maximize turnout. That raises the question about these laws requiring photo IDs and other things which are shrinking the eligible electorate. It seems to me that goes back to what we talked about several days ago on Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, which is the penalty that the 14th Amendment theoretically imposes on states that reduce the proportion of eligible voters. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We are at 52 minutes after the hour. We have about seven minutes, I guess, left in today's program. I'm almost reluctant to begin anything else. I'm kind of wondering whether in fact there would be opinion or ideas or suggestions or comments that we might be able to get in the last 4 or 5 minutes of today's program, rather than take on something else. I was prepared, very honestly, to get into Federalist number 84, which is the next to last of the Federalist Papers, principally dealing with the Constitution's lack of a Bill of Rights and Hamilton's justification or defense of that. But I think we'll defer to our programming next week for that. But I'm particularly enamored today with the Otto letter, more so than I was before, because I think that what we have done is add substance, add meat to the bones of that particular letter. I think it now has meaning to me that I believe is incredibly significant. Bob Kincaid, I'm wondering if you're there, my friend.
I am indeed.
Okay, I'm wondering, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, and I'm a little bit reluctant to get into anything new. I'm wondering if you have any reaction to this, and I don't like to put you on the spot, but I know, I know that we.
No, I sit here in slack-jawed wonder at this stuff, because I can't help but think, Dr. Bill, because I think about this kind of stuff, because I'm weird. How many, as a thought experiment, how many members of the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives, and let's go ahead and include the president, actually know about the Vergennes letter?
Mm-hmm. I would venture to guess that not many do.
I'm saying it's probably approaching. It's probably approaching zero.
I agree. One of the most interesting. It wasn't a conversation really, but the last time that I was talking to John Kaminsky, who basically unearthed this letter and published it, I was telling him how absolutely incredible I thought the letter was. And he said, "It sure contains some food for thought, doesn't it, Bill?" And I thought, "Oh my God, doesn't it?" You know.
Well, but I think there's a larger point to be maybe approached through this, Bill, and that's this: rather than being students of our own history, especially those whom we elect to governance, they are instead captives of our own mythology.
Okay.
It is far easier to lionize and get all warm and misty feeling about a country's mythological history of freedom than it is to do the hard work of actually reading and finding out what was motivating the people who created that freedom. I in the last several months, I've probably marked myself as some sort of proto-dictator wannabe for life or whatever. But I'm beginning to come back around, and I want to know more and study more. For instance, about James Madison's objections to a Bill of Rights, because it looks to me, especially in looking at the First Amendment. And I've argued this on my own program so many times that people can almost tell when I'm about to say it, that in modern America, the First Amendment has become little more than a life support system for the professional religion industry. You and I were talking before the program started a couple of hours ago about this vaccination bill that's been introduced in the West Virginia legislature by this Tea Party, tricorn hat-wearing, Gadsden flag-waving new legislature of ours. They are willing, by this legislation, which is very very like the social studies the legislation that we discussed last week. It's been introduced in whole cloth. It's not an interlineation here and a substitution there. It's entirely new text that I know darn good and well was not written by anybody in the state of West Virginia. And to that end, we have a fundamental want for understanding of freedom. I mean, for instance, as you have discussed so cogently, Abraham Lincoln revived the Declaration of Independence. It had more or less fallen into the dustbin of history, if you will.
Right. Disuse.
But he sees it as an animating force. And he saw it that way for his own, I think we can say, political reasons. It's okay. But that reinvigorates it with some sort of mythic power, so that we wind up with the Sarah Palins of the world mouthing it and understanding next to nothing about what it means.
No, exactly. Bob, you're right on.
And so with the Vergennes letter, I think there's a lot of benefit to be had from what we get in the way of an outsider's analysis of what he saw transpiring, and what Vergennes saw was a great big fraud being perpetrated. I mean, do I understand it correctly?
No, I think you do. I've resisted the use of the word fraud, but I've used duplicitous and a number of other words, obfuscation and a number of other words. But fraud is pretty blunt. But I think you're right. I think basically that what they've done is what they believed they had to do. And again, I'm not defending.
Well, they were being almost Matthew Arnold utilitarian.
That's right. They were basically beginning to see. They were seeing the beginning of the end of the republic that independence had produced, unless something monumental changed. And the problem is that the people, the citizens at large, would not advocate, would not support that kind of change unless we found another way to spin it.
Well, and let me just suggest this, put a little bug in your ear for future programs. This is something that I was discussing a few nights ago. by way of something I would love to hear you delve into, and that is an analysis of this country, such as it was, within the framework of the Articles of Confederation, and compare that to modern Europe's attempts to pull a confederation together via the EU. And the question then, is the EU doomed to the same fate as the Articles?
As the Articles, yes. That's a good question. Let me do some work on that, Bob. Bob, I think we've reached 3 o'clock. I know that Rick Smith is ready to go, but thank you for your comments. I appreciate you coming in at the end of the program, because I really was reluctant.
It's always my pleasure.
I was really unwilling to get into into a new subject, and I didn't want to weaken or destroy what we've already done.
No, let's wrap up the week and put a nice little bow on it and get back after it on Monday, shall we?
We'll do it, Bob. Thank you.
And Monday will be President's Day, will it not?
Oh, yes, I believe you're right. Thank you all very much for listening to today's version of the Virtual Center. Please stay tuned to the Horn and continue to support. I think more than ever we appreciate why it is so important to keep this progressive voice on the air. Thank you.